must be still.
We have 5 minutes to go.
Yes.
Very good to see you again.
Hello, hello. Nice to see you. I remember I was imagining your face when I heard that you might be joining us.
Yes, yes, I cannot miss this one. It's two of my real gurus.
You are safe in, you feel safe in Ahmedabad.
Yes. Well, it's everywhere, but one is at home.
Do you need, do you wear masks in the streets?
When I go out, yes.
Yes. Yes. We also do it whenever we are in a crowd of people or indoors. If we are
Yes,
walking,
that is true.
In the streets, we don't wear them.
Yeah, but you have very few people, and we have so many people that if I go out, there will be.
Just join it.
Can I join now?
Yeah.
Professor Doshi is here as well.
Hello,
Say hi.
Hello.
Doshi.
How are you, Juhani?
I'm fine.
You look very good, and always, of course, how many flights you have taken since we left Dhaka? It was more than 105, 110.
Well, I think I'm now totaling 109 rounds around the world. But
Yes.
in the last 6 months, I have not taken any trips. And I like it. I love it.
I know. So going around like this around the world, how do you see the change that is happening? When you go around like this, all the time you are in a different zone. Time zone is different,
Well,
technology is different.
I don't pay attention to it at all.
That's
It
very
doesn't
good.
affect me. It doesn't affect me anymore.
Doshi, we should remember the two stories of Kartikeya and Ganesh.
Yes.
Because Shiva had two sons.
Yes.
And he asked them, what was the question? He told them to
go around the world.
Go around the world, yes.
And they get the fruit of knowledge.
Yes. So Kartikeya was a very active one, and he actually went all around the world. In the meanwhile, Ganesh, who was the lazy one, he just went around his parents once, and he said, I've seen the whole world.
Yes. You know, the question is not what is happening, what we go around, but because it is always exciting. And I think what Juhani has done is that he has not only done this, but he's all the time discovering what is happening in the world. And not our world only, biological world, zoological world. I think all those things are very exciting because when we look at all this, where is the house? Where is the dwelling? What kind of a place do we live? And I think the kind of thought process there is very different. And I remember we were talking and he was explaining. And that is very fascinating.
I often tell my students that we are all more than several million years old. And that's the depth dimension that I'm interested in the human story nowadays. The origins and early history of mankind.
And are there any constants that you have discovered?
Any what? Constants? Well, I have discovered these interesting things. For instance, maybe I told you the pink triangle in the corner of your eye.
Yes.
You know what it is?
No.
The scientific name, medical name is Laika semilunaris, and that is the point in which the horizontally moving extra eyelid was fixed when we were lizards.
Oh.
Isn't it almost shocking that the human gaze is considered as the most human thing we have? Our lizard past is right there.
And what about their place in which they have been surviving or growing? Do they think something like we think?
Yeah, yes, and it's now a rather well-established fact that the first constructions humanoids, early humans made were not to protect themselves. They were burial constructions.
Okay.
So the first function of architecture was not a shelter for the builder as we tend to think. It was a mental thing, a mental dimension. The other reality, the reality of myths.
But that reality is, I think, very exciting because we are all the time struggling to create shelters for us and get confused in that shelter because we don't know whether it is for us or it is for somebody else to look at it or experience it.
But it's the main problem perhaps is that we don't really know who we are. The famous biologist Wilson, the American biologist, who has established the science of what's the name of his book? I'll tell you in a minute. In any way, in one of his books, he biophilia, in the book entitled Biophilia, he says that, has a sentence, the greatest problem humans have is that we do not know who we are and we cannot agree on what we want to become.
That is true. And since we do not agree, we don't agree on anything. We are all the time in flux, always changing and thinking who we are. And I think that's very true.
And I think we are living in an era now when there is more disagreement about things in the entire world than for a long time, perhaps ever. When you think of the political situations everywhere, just disagreements.
Yes.
Hi, Juhani.
Hello.
Hi, Prem here. Good to see you.
Hello. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I was just thinking today to write you a letter.
Oh.
So if you are ready, we can start. How does that sound? Or
I'm ready.
okay.
Yeah, I think so. It's fine. Sure.
So I welcome everyone here today, and of course, a very warm welcome to our two very special guests to another phenomenal evening on Poché Conversations. And we are very, very fortunate to have with us two exceptional people together on our panel in conversation. And none of them, either of them, need any introduction whatsoever. Professor Balkrishna Doshi has been teacher to many of us, and there are also many Ekalavyas amongst us who have accepted him as teacher and mentor in their hearts. And despite his many achievements, the buildings and spaces he has designed, his school of architecture, whose philosophy and intensity have shaped so many, and of course his Pritzker Prize, his greatest achievement still, I believe, are the lives he has shaped with his words, his teachings, and his way of thinking. Professor Juhani Pallasmaa, in very similar ways, has had a transformative effect on how we think about architecture, about our worlds and being in the world, and about an embodied experience of architecture. With books like The Eyes of the Skin that sit on 1 million bookshelves across the world and are required reading for students, his own architectural works, his long association with the Pritzker Committee as one of the jurors identifying value and often bringing quiet but significant practices to the fore, his synthesis of the works of Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, allowing them to be accessed by many through a rare clarity and care. And of course, in my own experience with the friendship between our families, many meals together and excursions in the city of New Delhi and the city of Helsinki, there's a sense of care with which he treats people, places, and ideas, which is rare and precious. As we near the end of the studio, I feel blessed that we have had such a variety of excellent minds on this panel who have really opened our minds and hearts to new ways of looking at our world, at trees, at water, our bodies, and of course, the city. We have traversed together on this journey with over 170 participating and auditing students and professionals from diverse backgrounds and nationalities, hoping to find a new way to look at our cities and the spaces within the city. We are seeking to look at time not as fixed, not as a fixed dimension to be measured and ascribed as a present, past, or a future moment. But most importantly, we are trying to do so with our entire being, not just our minds, and as part of a much bigger, something which is much bigger than us, and with humility, empathy, and care. So in context, I do not think we could have asked for anything more than being in the company of these two very special individuals this evening. And I'm sure we are all very eager to listen to them. So if I may start by putting a question about beginnings to you both, Professor Pallasmaa, Professor Doshi. Professor Pallasmaa, you have spoken about how you find yourself thinking more of your early years, perhaps growing up in a less urban part of Finland, and your later years in college, so much more than the later years in college where you were exposed to modern architecture as an architect. Could you talk a little bit more about that, about your growing up years and how it has had a more significant impact on you?
Yes, when one is young, I think it is normal to be intensely focused on the near future. You are more thinking of what will come tomorrow than thinking of what is happening today or what happened yesterday. I find myself increasingly going back to my early childhood experiences, which I realize have been fundamental in my attitudes and reactions and sensibilities. I'm grateful for the 5 war years which I spent at my farmer grandfather's tiny farm in central Finland and lived farm life. There was only one book in the household, the Bible. No radio, no television in those years. And I was the only boy within 3 kilometers distance. So I had endless days, and most of the time I observed nature and animals. And now, 80 years later, I return increasingly into those experiences and realize how fundamental they have been to my way of looking at the world. I'm usually introduced as a phenomenologist in philosophical sense. I have never studied philosophy academically, but I practice a kind of a farm boy's phenomenology. I still continue the same interest of observation that I did 80 years ago. And I try to teach my students this same intensity of observing and looking. That's possibly the best way of learning is just to face things and absorb the messages. I'm less and less intellectualizing things by age and just confronting, and primarily I would say emotionally, the things that appear in front of me.
It's interesting. Professor Doshi was, in fact, talking about it yesterday in his talk. Professor Doshi, you spoke about finding the child in oneself and looking and observing. And I was reminded of Goethe, who said, age does not bring childhood back again. Age merely shows us what children we remain. But why is it that we try so hard to become adults?
Well, in a way, I think life is not linear, it's circular. And that is why old age and childhood are necessarily connected. And when you begin to realize the circularity of things, that changes your fundamental attitudes. I think the problem in our current technological civilization is that we see things in a linear way. That's because of the obsession with progress and also the obsession with time. I have been very surprised that I have not heard a single politician or economist to speak about alternative economic strategies during the pandemic era, except a professor lady from Harvard University who spoke of circular economy, which I think is a very interesting idea. Instead of linear growth, we should go back to a circular economy, which economies used to be before the ideas of money and interest and growth entered our minds.
Professor Doshi, you have any thoughts on this?
I think there are similar things happen in everybody's life, because the life cycle from childhood to grown-up age, you become more and more aware about your body, about your limbs, about your career. So slowly from biological to physical to intellectual, I think this is the sequence which goes, and then from sequence again from that intellectual, you want to go back to biological, and then you go into not only psychological, but emotional, and you start asking fundamental questions. And I think this is a cycle which is very interesting if we have time to think about it. The questions that come up is that we are not looking at us, we look at world, and constantly we are concerned about what the world would think about us. And I think life is your own. When you are a child, you are fully aware about what you want to do because you are not conscious. But there is another force which is working, what we call the spiritual, the intentions of the biology, where the body, the skin, this breath, I think they are you are not aware, but you become conscious gradually, naturally. But as you go further, then you are looking at as a body as a physicality. And in that physicality, you gradually begin to look at outside world, and that world is not your own world, because then you are not there. You are influenced by the outside world. And I think whenever we try to talk about as we grow, who am I, and then what is my career, and what is my life, and what is the meaning of my life, I think that whole question becoming from nothing to I, and I begins to become me. And when that becomes me, the questions are not you at all. So slowly one goes away. And my life, I still, as I grew, I had a chance to, when I was not so conscious and I had done architecture in Bombay, and I left the school in third year and then went to London, but then I, by chance, went to Corbusier's office. Not knowing French, not knowing much about, because I had not gone to a real school of architecture. So what is architecture? And then what is a drawing, and what is the building? And when you don't know about it and you still wonder what is happening, and he's a great person that who was, everybody knew, and he did not, he knew, I'm sure, English, but he didn't want to talk about it in English. Now he wants to talk in French. I don't know French. So what he's trying to do is, he's trying to create a new language where a child can understand. So my learning and my consciousness happen to be of awareness of language, but meaning of that language. So not knowing history of architecture, not knowing who Corbusier was, and I just went by chance. And he, by my luck, he was starting to work in India. So he's perhaps in understanding that I am an Indian, so at least something I would know. So he would really talk about India and me, and then he would explain to me the questions or maybe the kind of thing that he was doing. So a behavior science of life became, for example, for me, a new exposure. So when you really don't know much about things, and then you really want to know, and when somebody is going to invent something else from another culture, and he doesn't know that he cannot talk to me in French, he wants to talk to me in English, and knowing that I don't know much about architecture, then the whole question is, you are talking about things which one doesn't know. So the line for me was very different. Drawing a figure, he would draw the figures, very small figures on the drawing, and then one day I copied the figures. So the next day he came and he looked at it, and with his eyes and glasses open like this, he looked like this so closely, and he says, you have drawn this? I said, yes. But then he says, do you know, you have drawn too many, and the figures are not correct, they are not indicative. So slowly, this is the way really my education started. Learning from experience, but from emotions. Guessing something else and trying to find what is underneath that place. And that was really slowly started talking about architecture, and then I started practicing architecture. But the interesting thing was that we always talk something which we presume we know. But when we have no idea about it, then it is very important. So when I started the school, not having gone to the school, and I became a head of a school and I started a school. So the question was, how do you really discover? So the idea was, I am not a teacher, senior person. A student is not a student, is the one who is trying to learn. Unless I change my position and I become a student and ask the same question that he would have perhaps asked, and we jointly discover something that we don't know, and this is really how I started. So in the third year, I said, can we draw an imaginary animal? And when that question came up, I did not know either. So now the students are not knowing. So when they had to decide an imaginary animal, they began to think about all kinds of things. So whether it's a tail or an ear or a horn or eating or a body which is long or a short or tall. Now all those things for them was a discovery, but for me they were even more discovery because I did not know. So I learned through the students' knowledge something that I wanted to know. So I pretended to be senior and I was asking them what I wanted to know. So really what it means is that you are talking about life as you grow, you learn, and then you become a student, you become a teacher, you become something else. So learning was for me very important. But in all this, I was asking one question: what is the meaning of life? Because Corbusier's buildings were there, we talked about buildings, but we never spoke about aesthetics of architecture there, in a sense, physically saying this is beautiful, this is not beautiful. Because it was not his intention. He was drawing and he was making a section, and I had to discover over time what it is. So when you don't know things and when you have to find something that has happened, then you begin to ask. So the question that we are asking is, when we go to school of architecture, we are already defined architecture. We already defined the word. And that word, I think, is one of the things which is not a correct thing. So as one goes along, then one begins to discover that there are other things to learn about this life. So what I nowadays think is, if I have to ask the student to talk, I would say, can they live life fully? Do you live life fully? The reason was full size, live life full size. Now, why it is a question? Because that is the really intention, that unless you know what is the meaning, what is it that you are consciously or unconsciously knowing, and this is really what it is. So this is where I began my career, and that is how I then started practicing.
Can I add one more aspect to this? For me, a kind of a second birth took place in the early 70s when I worked or taught 2.5 years in Ethiopia at the Haile Selassie University. Only there I realized how strongly we are products of culture. I realized that my world and patterns of thinking, my values were different from those of my students. First, I thought I'm going to teach them, but then I realized that I was the one who was learning, and I somehow learned during those 2.5 years to step aside my own cultural obsessions, which was a very importantly liberating moment for me. I began to read anthropological literature, for instance, psychoanalysis and so forth. In many ways, I questioned what I had learned until then, and even I questioned my self-image, who I was. So in many ways, those 2.5 years in another culture of became fundamental for me. And then through my studies, reading in anthropology, I realized how deeply conditioned we are by our specific culture. Not only certain conscious ideas, but unconscious reactions. For instance, our relationship with space is culturally conditioned. And after all of that, I have become rather critical of the current practice of architects building across cultural boundaries. And simply because for a Western European, it's impossible to understand Indian reality deeply. And I think I have often thought that architects who will build in a different culture should have a special examination, a special pass to do that. Otherwise, they will distort things and confuse people's reactions.
In India, the issue is that we look at life differently, in a sense that there is more spiritual than physical.
Yes.
And it is that spirit which is the intent, which is connected to the unmeasurable, the awareness which is there, which is inherent. So we talk about soul, we talk about body, we talk about this, but finally we talk about the emotions which are there, the kind of emotions through which we operate, the gestures, the proximity, the relationship, the transaction. And as a result, what happens for us, the idea of space is not something outside us. It looks like that it is part and parcel of us. So psychologically for us, nothing is alien, nothing is outside. And so
that was also the early European thinking. Plato, for instance, argued that everything in human life is always placed.
that's right.
Yes, so it's more or less the same idea, but we Europeans have forgotten that very much.
Actually, the function is a natural phenomena. I want to sit, so I sit. I want to walk, I want to walk. I want to really touch something, I touch. So I have the whole idea, I mean, in our culture or when we talk about this, we assume that it is an extension of our body, of our emotions, of our psyche. So the relationship between space, form, structure, etc. is as if that they are members of my body. Now, as a result, what was happening is that emotion plays an important role in this transaction. And in that, there are no problems of structure. There are no problems of something, which will work, which will not work. So when you are in a fluid space, and when you are really talking about your emotion is to sit down and dance, you move the table and you can do something and you have the space. So what happens is the body and the space are constantly interconnected, as if the limbs have extended, emotions have extended, and entire thing becomes one. They are not separate. So the material idea, the constraints of the material, or the kind of division that we make between I and you, or it is possible, it is this or that. So it is malleable. So the whole question is the space fluid? is making of a building. Is it the body that I'm making? Is it really the thing that I can communicate with that body? And I think this is really one of the essential parts. So it is like anthropocentric that you are changing. To give you an example, if I have this room and I have to do some rituals which are sacred rituals, which are little away, I would just turn this place around, create some rituals, create a diagram, draw the diagram, and symbolically I have made that space in the mindset that I have. So I have made it into a temple. The moment I have made it into a temple, psychologically, I don't think about the space. I think of whole thing as one. And when that entire thing is one, I have lost myself. And the space and the form and the structure have become me. Now, this is where I think our culture talks about.
So just to kind of bring it back to our studio, and which is, these talks are part of this studio that we are doing on New Delhi. And I know that Professor Pallasmaa, whenever he's in Delhi, what he enjoys most is a rickshaw ride through the old city of Shahjahanabad. He's never been much interested in seeing the other parts of Delhi. And what I wanted to ask you both, and I think we've lost Professor Pallasmaa, and hopefully he'll join us soon. But do you, in the other parts of Delhi, which are far more legible, or in a sense that there is this privilege to geometry and visual clarity in these other parts of Delhi, far more than other cities in India, in fact, do you see any virtue to the legibility that these parts offer? Or why is it that we still prefer to the lived city far more than these other kinds of spaces in the city?
I think as Juhani said, that this is really the product of touch and feeling. So you use the whole organism, your whole body biologically, and you get a sense of space, smell, touch, and the joy that what is there. And I think this is where the difference is, that your identity becomes one and not separate and not fragmented. So the more crowd you see, the noise of the rickshaw, the kind of rickshaw and the surrounding that is there, and gradually you smell, and then you look at the touch, or you sense everything. And I think you become more and more aware, and you become fascinated by that biological connection.
Yeah. Professor Doshi, you were speaking about the charcoal drawing yesterday, and how the charcoal stick as a tool
Yes.
Heightens a sense of consciousness, and one is fully aware. And I bring this up because we are also looking at the tool in a interesting way. Yeah, Professor Pallasmaa has joined us again. So we were talking about the tool, and that it's in the use of the tool where the ego kind of sort of dissolves. Do you really agree with that?
Sorry, I went blank for
Yeah, we lost you for a while.
10 minutes. Sorry.
No problem. I think we had a chance to discuss these things, when we were in Dhaka. So what I was talking about is the biological understanding. And when you mentioned about the ancient beginnings, the sense of touch is the essential thing to become aware. I think you had mentioned just before. And I was talking about this, that our body really, when the body gets physically, then emotionally, then psychologically connected to the world, when the world approaches to you, when you are in a rickshaw and you hear the sound and you feel the body touch, a movement and whatnot, I think we lose the distinction of separation. And I think it is important that when you want to enjoy, see the whole idea of perception is psychological to me. That everything that you do, there is an inner core which is having the conversation. The brain doesn't, intellect is put aside. Emotions take over, memories take over, the kind of characteristics take over. And your childhood or your body, which is not really disciplined in mental ways, becomes very important. And I think that is where the difference has happened now, that whenever architecture is talked about, it is all separation. A wall is a wall. Wall is not me. The staircase is not me. I think all those things now have become so important. And then the question is of materials. When there is a texture, you talk very often about the textures of surfaces, the kind of nature of surface and the tactile quality of the surface. How does it really affect emotionally when there is a patina, when there's a rains come in? I think all those things, are not anymore talked about in present day architecture. We look at them as inert matters, far away.
Yes, well, this is what you are saying suggests or means that we have, as human beings, in our age, we are becoming increasingly visual creatures. And even more specifically, we are becoming creatures of focused vision.
Yes.
Whereas biologically, ecologically, the peripheral vision is more important. Danger always comes from the periphery, not from the focus center. And so this development towards focused visuality and rejection of other senses is a totally unbiological process. And we are accelerating that today, for instance, with the kind of instruments we use today, which detach our body from our communication increasingly with the world. Things become entirely abstract in the sense of lacking the connection with place and time and body. And in my view, it is the task of architecture to resurrect the humans as sensual, sensory persons, and also bring back emotion to our relationship with each other and the world.
Yes. The other thing. No, go ahead. Sorry.
There are philosophers and that argue that there is not even any thinking without emotion. They argue that every idea, every expression always begins as an emotional choice. So the development away from emotional connection and meanings is a very strange, unscientific orientation. But so much what we are doing today is just simply foolish. For instance, in Finland, handwriting, we call it, which connects the words, the letters to each other, that was stopped in schools.
Oh.
This is just, stupid, because it is exactly this collaboration of the hand and the eye and the mind that roots language deeply into our being. But I could mention a number of examples where just willingly current culture goes away from what is the natural, the responsible thing to do.
Yes. I think idea of rejoicing things. In making things, you rejoice the things and you enjoy the experience of the whole act of rejoicing. Really takes the whole body with us together. And at that time, the periphery disappears and a form appears there which also delights the eye. Was in Kutch long back, and I saw one gentleman there who was making the hut for himself. And he took the mud and then he took the sand, mud, etc., put his feet there with water. And gradually, when he was making that wall was made as if it was a representation of his body. And the surface, when it came, the corners disappeared and they became rounded. And he was feeling, I'm sure, with his palm, the kind of roundness. And when he made it and when he went up gradually, he created a very different but very subtle, sensuous ending to that wall. And then he created the opening. He stood little away, and after a while, he painted the edge white so that it embarked, he made an emphasis of that entry that he had to say, this is the place which is the center of the place. Now, to me, this example is so important because it was his extension, almost a sacred act. But today, if we'll say it is not a wall. Second thing is that we want to talk about something which is produced from outside. And when we get it, then we are obeying that one. So architecture word really is not the correct word, neither building. It is the creation and extension of oneself. So for me, that is what I think one should talk about.
So, Professor
Yes.
Pallasmaa, before you left, or rather after you left, we were talking about the city, in fact, and I was telling Professor Doshi that whenever you are here in Delhi, you always like to go for a rickshaw ride in the old city, and you are not much interested in the city of the New Delhi or the city where it's more of a city of legibility. And I think that kind of led to this discussion. So what Professor Doshi is talking about, that little white marking around the entrance as a way of creating legibility. But the gesture of a city where you make a legibility with a strong axis or a line, how are the two acts different?
Sorry, I didn't understand now. Two acts. Which act?
Yeah, so Professor Doshi was talking about this mud wall and how he makes a little white paint on the border of the entrance as a way of demarcating entrance, and that is also a form of legibility, of making it more readable, as well as the city, where somebody draws an axis and makes that into a legible kind of a gesture in a city.
Both belong to the acts of inhabitation, how we inhabit the world and make a connection between ourselves and the world. And there is a fundamental difference, of course, between traditional societies where more or less everyone built his or her home, and to the current situation where dwellings are becoming increasingly consumer products. We are outsiders to our home entirely nowadays, in comparison with Doshi's example of the man who built a mud house. There's also an observation which I made in Bandiagara in Mali, where I went to see the Dogon settlements, which are among the finest of any traditional environments. Their construction seems to be entirely tactile. It's entirely controlled by touch, by the hand. But then they didn't have glasses and windows either. Now that they were introducing windows, the windows are almost necessarily rectangular. They are hard-edged, sharp, and it was possible to see right there on the individual construction sites how architecture was turning from a tactile exercise to a visual practice, which introduces a distance and intellectuality to the process. So I'm again giving an example of how history, human history, can make us understand the misery of today's condition, but we are so blinded by our belief in progress that we do not willingly accept that things would get worse. I think things are getting worse exactly in this sense, that we are becoming isolated in our world. And as Heidegger already wrote in the early 50s, the modern man has forgotten the skill of dwelling. We can't dwell anymore, partly exactly because we don't have those connections, personal connections with our environments anymore. We gather things, objects from our parents and from our trips abroad as kind of memory devices, but that's not at all as powerful as living in a house which you have built by your own hands.
I think what you're saying is so accurate, so correct and obvious. But the problem is that we don't think that it is an extension of ourself. Sense of belonging comes when you do things yourself with your own hand. And there are no, even though there may be some errors, inaccuracies, you accept them as if they are your children. I think that kind of connection you find in the old houses which are done by mud, and over time they would draw something on it. They may add something to the surface. They may adjust it with the surrounding trees and the landscape. And gradually they create their own world where their affection to that world is an extended family, similar to that. And I think this is what we have forgotten today. Everything that we have, what we use, what we are talking, the relationship we have created a shield there, a wall there, that this is not mine, this is not my world, and this is not my feeling. So as a result, what you say is so accurate, so correct, that where is the ownership? Who is the owner? And when you become an owner, what does it do to you in terms of your health, your thinking, your relationships, your tolerance, and accepting situations even though they were not expected? So this sense of space, sense of enclosure, sense of building, and sense of what you call proximity. They all were like a cluster of community people staying together. And therefore, it was quite different from a series of buildings which are put next to one another and they don't belong to you at all. So, issue of a straight line and a crooked line or a line which shifts from one to the other, I think has a lot more meaning to them, but we are thinking that that is not what is correct. And I think this is where the difference is.
I mentioned the Dogon people in Mali, in the Bandiagara Canyon. Their architecture and object making and sculpture is known because all of their acts are connected with their mythology, their understanding of how the world came about. And even the way all the positions and steps they do when preparing land for seeds, they are all defined by these mythological stories. The way they sleep in their bed comes from the myths, which means that everyday acts, the mundane acts, connect them with the mythical other world, which you use the word spiritual dimension. We have lost all of that, and that is one of the messages of Heidegger's essays on dwelling, is the loss of this mythical dimension. We, as my friend, the philosopher the professor of philosophy at Yale University, Carsten Harris. Have you ever met Carsten Harris, Doshi?
No, I have not met him.
A very fine gentleman. He has a powerful argument where he says we dwell in both space and time, and the task of architecture is to free us from the terror of time. At least in the Western current industrial societies, I can sense the terror of time immediately when I step in the street. Why do we love to be in old cities in Europe or anywhere else? Why do I love to go through the old Delhi in a rickshaw? Because I enter another time, a slow time, and I also find myself being surrounded by life, not architecture.
Yes. So if one really extend this thought which you are presenting, would then the present way of building and teaching architecture to the students, where we talk about engineering and construction and production and mass-produced items like bricks and concrete and panels and doors and windows, what kind of a message would they give you? Are you can we liberate the students by saying that you must feel about it, you must touch, you must sense, and then you must pause and say, do you really like it? Is it your friend or not friend? So if we don't teach that to the students, and if we start teaching them with a ruler and computer and straight lines where you don't get a straight line at all, would we ever get the buildings of such beauty that you see in ancient architecture or monuments or ritual places? Because the issue would be, to me, are we talking education as one of the rituals of making people more socio-psychological, culturally sensitive people? Or are we talking about teaching students through computers and production-oriented attitudes, saying that no, we are talking about an object which has nothing to do with your life or with your emotion? And I think this is the big issue today in education.
Yes. One of the writers or scholars important in my life is Gaston Bachelard, the French philosopher or science and poetic imagery. He distinguishes two different imaginations: formal imagination and material imagination. And he argues that material imagination conveys stronger emotions than formal imagination. I think this is a very, very appropriate observation, again connected with the pure visuality of contemporary world and architecture. I have already 15 years given tasks to students where they work from the very beginning, the first moment onwards, with material. And it leads to a completely different process and surprising results. So I'm telling this just to suggest that there are alternative ways to approach architecture, which we should explore.
What would be that, that if you have to take a second year or first year or any year in the class, if we don't use what kind of tools or what kind of image or what kind of judgment would we have? Because there needs to be a measure of how is it right, wrong, conversation-wise, understanding-wise, what would be that?
Well, I think it's very much we emphasize intellectuality. We tend to think that understanding is a category of the intellect.
Okay.
We do not usually accept that emotions also judge, and emotions are perhaps much more important and accurate in judgment than intellect.
That's right. So would that mean that if we start using and allowing people to become emotional, sensitive, they would become much more what we call related to, as if that they are talking about creating an extended family.
Yes.
And I think that is what you are saying. Is that correct?
Yes. And I'm also, my attitude is that I'm not trying to teach what architecture is. I tell my students in the beginning that I'm not going to teach you what architecture is. I'm trying to teach you or make you aware of who you are. Because who you are, without that self-identity, no knowledge has any context or has any meaning. The sense of self is so important. But usually, at least in Western countries, education traditionally tended to weaken the sense of self.
Yes.
I think the artistic education, at least, should build a strong, self-conscious self, and a rich one, which is part of the world.
Yeah.
Instead of an ego, separate ego.
In the traditional Indian architecture or the habitation, the most important thing was celebrating life.
Yes.
So when you start celebrating life and you assume that, then you are all the time, but unconsciously or not obviously, saying that we must make it very graceful, very beautiful, very lovable. You must be able to feel as if you are extending your body and creating this space. So the ceremony happens, that every space that you enter, you want to recognize, identify, and honor that space. And you create a little niche. You may create a place there, you may create some kind of a projection. All this they would do with an idea that this is my extended family.
Yeah.
So the dwelling and their life, ongoing over time, has a very different relationship. And when they enter into that space and sit there together, your thought process changes and you begin to talk about affinity, sensitivity, the kind of joys and sorrows of life. Arguments become very different and everything becomes pardonable, forgettable, and connecting. All the time the relationship continues. But if there is a new building which is built today with a glass box, absolutely rectangular, and then the furniture is put there as if it is to be sitting, but none of these are meant to perform the way the person who is going to use freely, comfortably. And so there is a psychological formality which gets in.
What you are saying makes me remember a beautiful idea by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He
Yes.
says, "We come not to see the work of art, we come to see the world according to the work."
Yes.
I think this is a very, very important observation and lesson also. Today, architecture doesn't care about the world; it cares about itself.
Yes.
And it in another idea of Merleau-Ponty is that he asks, what else could a painter or a poet do than express his encounter with the world?
Yeah.
My question is, what else could an architect do? I think architect has the same task to make us feel how the world touches us, and making a home is the most subtle situation to make us touch the world. We almost become one with the world.
Yes. I think when I was talking about this, then a situation like that where you are one with that world, time is not a consideration. You would linger there for a much longer time because there will be no idea that you are separate. And that
Yes,
idea
that's
of
right.
separation and time.
Yes, you are right. In unity, time disappears. In difference, it is accelerated. Yes.
Yeah. I think the dialogue which we talk usually like this dialogue, but supposing that there is a dialogue which is defined by well organized, precise conditions, and the other way is the dialogue which is arranged informally where you can sit, you would not think about time. You would not think about whether you are saying, you are not even sure what you are saying is consciously or naturally. I think that obvious consciousness, that formality, that feeling that I should not hurt somebody, I think should not come into the picture. And that can only happen when things are made as if they belong to you. So the sense of belonging is very important. Don't you think so?
Yes, yes, and ultimately, we all live in worlds that we have made ourselves.
Yes.
It is the world of our life and history and consciousness that we are projecting around us, and that's where we live. That's also usually forgotten, and there is a tendency to think that the world is there, and we are just outsiders to it and looking at it. No, we project the entire world ourselves.
Yes. I saw in Pompeii years ago when I had gone to Italy after the earthquake, they made some models there. And those models of human beings around and the houses, etc. I was so fascinated by the whole atmosphere and the kind of location, the image over what was happening there. It's like a theater there of what must have happened at that time. And I was quite happy that they were done as if it was not realistic, but it was casually indicative of the whole episode, the horror that happened, and the kind of body, the postures, the incomplete people are there lying halfway through work, bent, people are bent. And that what made me feel was, if it was made into a show window in New York or any other department store, it would never affect me at all. But there, I really felt for a minute and imagined the kind of eruption must have happened. And I think what we are talking about is, should not really then an architect think about that those are the events which have memories, which have subtle nuances, which have something to communicate. Should this not be the intention of creating a built form or a place?
Well, Bashlar says that home is a place where we can dream safely.
Yes.
Architecture should support our dreaming, daydreaming, and night dreaming as well.
Yes. So how does one do? How do we do that today? In India we have 800 schools, if I'm not correct, and 20,000 architects come out every year, and that production line is really becoming bigger. And how does one really then work in this country? And what would you suggest we should start with?
I don't have a suggestion for you. I would just say that I'm very how would I say, critical of the orientation of architectural education nowadays, which turns and also architects themselves and their associations. We tend to turn our craft into a service profession. We sell services just as lawyers do, and we build for anyone who just pays for the job. I think we architects should get back the wider understanding that we used to have back in history. Architects were the respected men in societies because of their deep wisdom. But we have willingly given up that ethical ground and just become, and we sell professional expertise.
Yeah.
Expertise altogether, as one of my heroes, Joseph Brodsky, the Russian poet, says that no real craftsman gathers expertise, he gathers uncertainties.
Yes, it's true. No, would that mean that we should really change the whole idea of a classroom into a studio, or like the atelier of the old times, where you are allowing them to explore yourself and the world as you conceive, and a teacher is just a guide and a catalyst.
In many ways, so I think the teachers in our societies, at least in the Western world, implant a distinct practice and set of attitudes and values into the mind of the innocent student. I think we should rather prepare the individual mind to receive the impact of their own life and create their own attitude towards architecture. Architecture simply has become too formalized on all levels.
You know, the old ateliers, bodegas, where they were there would be discussions, there would be models, and they would look like warehouses almost, if I imagine. Would that be the right way to create an atmosphere for the school learning, that a student is not sitting in a line, but he's free to observe, he's free to think, he's free to really create something which he felt like doing, rather than the big teacher, who comes in an authoritarian way.
Yes, I fully agree. When I began to work in architects' offices in the late 50s, they looked like artists' ateliers.
Yes.
There was a bohemian sense and liberation and a strong tactile feel of the profession because of all the, papers and materials and instruments and certain disorder also. Whereas when I visit an architect's office nowadays, I have a feeling that I have entered a lawyer's office. Somehow the atmosphere of making and free thinking and empathic thinking has completely disappeared.
I think the little chaos, unorganized sense, partly gives you a scope and a chance to play the game. You want to remain a child. You want to remain a little free person, and not say, this is my life, this is how I have to do. Don't you think so?
Yes, and it's also the psychological or perceptual fact that our vision and consciousness is most active at the periphery, at the boundaries. I think this applies also to school education. It should create such boundaries where students individually to which students individually react, and they become different individuals because of the lack of strict instruction.
Yes. I was even thinking that today everything is become so clean, so mechanical, and so organized that everybody says we must finish in this time. I was thinking that if there is a chaotic situation, exactly the opposite, at least in a part, not the whole place. And there you had those little studios, which are connected, but little away from that with the noise and others. And those clusters have these students who work, come there, learn, see, they can have a tea break, they can come back, so that we can allow the student to really think about his life as if, that he is a master, and he becomes more creative.
Yes, because in becoming an artist or an architect, the main moment, I think, is the fusion of self and
Yes.
your work,
Yes.
till the point that when you work, you are all, in fact, working on yourself.
Yes.
Wittgenstein has a beautiful sentence in one of his collections of ideas when he says, architecture and philosophy are similar. They are both ways of working on yourself.
Yes. Yes, very true. No, I really feel that today we decide a condition of production so many architects per year. But if we say that it is okay because we need a factory of people to do things mechanical, but to create excellence, to create unusual things, to create exceptional models, we must add on there, small cells of things, where people can come and they get lost, but they become creative and they create something which is a new demonstration.
Yeah.
So many
And
schools
also,
are added. Yeah, go ahead.
also, I think we should give up the idea of architecture as a specialization. Architecture is a generalization. It is probably the human craft that that combines all aspects of life, physical, mental, environmental, etc. So the idea of educating young minds into specialists in building is an absurd idea.
Yes. I feel that during what I gather from what one talks or hears or reads, during the Renaissance time, there were these bottegas and then there were streets, where there are models. And so really you were walking through the whole world where you are always imagining, inspiring, getting ideas, and constantly you're thinking about creations, not obligations. And I think, would that not be a nice thing that in some places we create these little campuses which are left over and people can really come and be free? Would you advise something like that?
Yes, yes, I would. And I would also question that probably no great architect is a product of a school. All great
Yes.
architects are self-made men and women who have just fitted their life into the context of construction. But the need to be personally, individually active and develop one's own thinking and philosophy, and especially ethics, is the key.
Going to Italy and looking at those palaces, and one begins to see the kind of environment there with the photographs and objects and surroundings. I always wonder, how do we really, if we were spending time there, I'm sure a lot of stimulation would happen to us because we would start thinking about another kind of world. I also will breathe that place. We would like to cherish and dream something else. And if we really think like that and at least if there are 100 buildings, make one building like this. And that building becomes a model where people can really come and look at it, cherish. Now, all those things are going away and they are becoming production houses, time-bound production houses.
Well,
And that is the Indian condition. So
I think it would be important for students and in education not to teach architecture as a separate thing, as a walled-in discipline. In my entire life, whenever I have started a new project, I've never looked at photographs of other architects in similar tasks.
Yeah.
Never. I have always gone to look at icon paintings, the Siena school paintings,
Yes.
Fra Angelico, and so forth, Piero della Francesca, and all the way to the Impressionists. I think it is much more, how would I say, inspiring to seek inspiration from the other arts, which than architecture, which focuses immediately on a distinct disciplinary professionalist attitude. Look at Fra Angelico Alvarado
Yes.
when he was a young man.
Yes.
Look at Fra Angelico.
You know, the company, like the School of Athens, the kind of painting, you know, where you see all artists and people, scholars, mathematicians, philosophers, they all gather, and they don't gather in a line. They don't gather in a row or in a particular hierarchical way. But there is a spirit, you know, in which they have come to celebrate things. And what I think one should really talk about is that how can we create in India places of celebration where architects can go and nourish their soul and skills. What would you suggest? You have been coming to India, so would you suggest something for us?
Well, you are one of the richest countries on earth in terms of architectural marvels. Just take the stepped wells as one example, which have had a very powerful impact on me. I have made maybe 100 variations of small staircase images cast in bronze, mainly inspired by the stepped wells.
Oh, yes.
So your country is a very, very rich country. I would say almost any country has this richness if you just find it back in the history.
That's right, yes. Are we all right on time?
Yes, I did not want to interrupt this beautiful conversation that you were having, and I had some questions, but I think that it could, there was far more here for us than all of these questions could have answered. Maybe one last one I could just,
Sure,
you know,
please.
yeah, is it okay?
Yes, of course.
Oh. So, you know, over this past few days, we have been speaking a lot about memory and timelessness of memory. Could you both speak a little bit about forgetting and maybe the value of forgetting as well?
Yeah, Juhani.
Why don't you begin, Doshi? While you talk.
Actually, I always, I don't know why, but I have a habit of getting lost myself on the way. So this whole issue is very dear to me because once you get lost, you have gone to another world and another place. And I think that is a continuous enjoyment because you never knew where you were before. And that is the way I think we should work out life like that, you know, just stories, all stories.
Well, forgetting, of course, is the pair of memorizing. If we didn't have a capacity to forget, our capacity of memorizing would be filled very quickly. But forgetting is also has an ethical dimension in human communication, and thinking of also even historical events. We humans need to have the capacity to forget, because forgetting becomes forgiving,
Yes.
eventually, and that is significant.
Yes, it's true.
Professor
Also,
Pallasmaa,
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead, please. No, you go ahead.
So I was saying, Professor Pallasmaa, I actually heard of the value of forgetting from you way back in 2006 when you had come for the Kurula Varki Forum in Ahmedabad. And I think I remember you quoting Joseph Brodsky again, where you said that in the end, all that you remember will not come to your aid. And um, what you have forgotten will be your best friend.
Yeah, yes.
So true. That's very true.
Well, also Rilke, the master poet, he has different formulations on what writing a piece of poetry really is, and we tend to think that it is a certain feeling, which is the ground for a poem to come about. He says, no, poems are always experiences, and then he lists what kind of experiences. Half a page of experiences of hearing the cries of women in labor, staying at the bed of the dying, etc., etc., just endlessly. And then he ends up this almost half a page or 1 page of listed items, he says. And only when all of this has been forgotten, when it has become part of your blood circulation,
Yes.
then on a lucky day, the first line, the first word of a verse can emerge. It's so monumental that this is not what I believe in. Also in architectural education, we need to have those experiences, and the students need to have those experiences because they are the raw stuff, material for new ideas.
Yeah, I think nowadays we have forgotten the idea of getting lost. And even in the design, we make it so efficient that you can't make a mistake, you just get bored and you get out very fast. The labyrinth, has been one of the great things that one happens. And that is why I believe that the straight line is not the line which is the right line for joy. But a line has to be a little crooked, so sometimes you want to not go at all, we can pause, or you walk around, or you meet somebody by accident. And I think those streets and those places of towns and cities where things have been added on, things have been modified, the buildings have been provided, they become different.
Yeah, you can
Yes.
talk.
What you said reminds me of Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentine writer. Last night I was reading his book of seven of his essays, which is called Seven Evenings, and he has written very powerfully about labyrinths. As architectural, fundamental images in our architecture. I have written myself on labyrinths, and this continues what you said. On one hand, architecture, the task of architecture, is to clarify, to make us find our way, but at the same time, it also needs to be a labyrinth where we get lost.
That's right. I think that is what Indian architecture has. Old Indian architecture has many such pauses. Meandering, not at all going. And it gives us time, it gives us an occasion. It also gives us an unexpected situations. And I think unexpected situations are important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So time has flown quickly, and there has been so much to chew on, and you both have certainly given us a lot to think about. So I don't know how you both feel about maybe taking a few questions from some of our panelists, or would you? I think it's also been a long evening for everyone, so I would leave it to both of you how you would like to do that.
Best way is that we leave it to you. You are organizing. So,
So, any of the panelists would they like to say something or some observations?
I would like to have some contact with the panelists.
Yes, if
Question.
yes.
Yeah, if I can ask a question. You all spoke about knowing yourself, about living life fully, and one would agree with that. But I was connecting that to a podcast I heard a couple of days ago of Michael McCarthy, who used to be the editor on environment for The Independent. And he said a problem is that our moral codes are totally anthropocentric, and we need a wider moral code than that. And when we've sought that wider morality, we've tended to rely on the language of science and statistics, and that's a very immobilizing language. So we need to develop the language for a moral code that also invokes nature. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions on that line.
Are you asking me or both of us?
yes, please, you go ahead, Johan.
I have been very interested and written several pieces on the differences and similarities of science and art. And in a way, they are totally different. For instance, that was Bachelard's point, and he was a chemist himself, and one of the best, most respected philosophers of science until his middle age. So he has certain authority when he argues that science has no way of saying anything meaningful about life. That's almost a shocking idea, but I think I know what it means. And at the same time, Einstein once wrote that science and art are both energized by mystery.
By what?
By mystery.
Yeah, mystery, yes, sure.
I think that is correct also. And I think that would be one wisdom to learn, would be to understand the interplay and dialogue of science and art in contemporary world. As we all know, in Renaissance time, they were the same.
Yes.
Same thing. The artists were the scientists also. So maybe there could be a new Renaissance through the unification of the two now separate realms of science and art.
I think so. When you look at nature and when you look at the kind of general public, etc., you will find that when you want to analyze, you come across many situations where there are gaps. And I think those gaps, are based on the whims of people, the situations that are there, circumstances are there. So there are innumerable variations possible. And therefore, what you're saying is correct, that unless we allow that to open up and give a chance to rediscover something else. I think it is not a good, it's a good thing to have variations always. Exceptions are the rules.
I have my confidence in art. I think art is the most powerful and genuine expression of human nature.
Yes.
And I have observed that whenever I read or meet a impressive scientist or impressive this or that professional, they very often are very inspired by art. Somehow art has entered their specialization and humanized their craft. There are even lawyers who are interested in art.
It's true. Very true. So Sudipto,
You're muted.
Sudipto, you're not mute.
Sorry about that. So, what do you think about this this new way of communication? I know it's, we spoke about the detachment of the tool and the instrument from the body, but this new way of communicating, that is this new technology, the virtual imaging, this has kind of opened up new possibilities at the same time. But what do you, how do you see this going?
I can tell you one thing. I would have, a few years ago, Juhani came because we requested him to come, and it was so nice of him to come to Ahmedabad. He found time, and then I met him again in Dhaka, and then we started talking about travel and everything else. Journeys are very tiring. This instrument is the best thing that I found today, and I'm so glad that I'm able to meet, Juhani and have a chat with him. And I think if there is more time, then we could really go on meandering, walking, talking, reminiscing. I think it will be wonderful because one can then talk about his travels and what he saw and what he discovered. And then I may reflect and then talk about something else. I think the dialogues like this are very rare, and we should have those things. And I'm very glad that you arranged it. And, I am having, now I know how to get hold of Juhani, and so I can always tell him that, do you have some time? We can have a chat.
I understand what Doshi is saying, but I must say sincerely that for me, online connections are very tiresome because they demand such focused concentration, for the reason that, as psychologists have shown, 80% of human communication is nonverbal and unconscious. And so in online communication, we base the communication on only 20% of usual communication. And that's what demands you to focus all the time.
Oh, but I think this is a choice which can always switch off. I think that's not the point. I think this is a good way to at least connect, because otherwise,
Yes.
after a few years,
Okay.
it's few years have gone by and we never had a chance to sit down and have a drink or have a discussion. And I'm so glad and so thankful that you found time. Now I can take that pause and say, Juhani, I would like to have some kind of a talk because I am concerned about these issues. Can you enlighten me on this?
But the sad thing is that we have to have the drink another time.
That's right. Of course, we should. Of course. Yes. But
This
it's
has
so
been
nice. Wonderful.
Yeah, this has been most wonderful, and I think if there are so many questions in the question and answer box from the attendees that I am scared to even venture there. So I think that this has been a nice. I find that there is enough that you've given us to really chew on, and I think we need this time to kind of think about all that you've said.
One thing only I would like to suggest, that what we talked about, education and school and kind of a professional sensitivities to the environment, I think those things somehow we must bring back in our discussions and see that it has an impact on the institutions themselves. Because the whole idea is eventually that when we have our own people who are becoming graduates and who are going to practice, if they become more sensitive than what we are talking about, that will be nothing. It would be a great, great advantage and contribution to environment in India. It's a great tool for us in the school.
Professor Doshi, on that note, I want to ask you something that both of you have alluded to. In some case, in some way, that though institutions are important, that in the present state of things, institutions are contracting rather than expanding the space in which students learn. I would just like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on this, and also in some ways our platform is hoping to do that in different ways, and what advice you'd have for us in using new technologies, as Mr. Pallasmaa was saying, that one has to be a little careful because of what is held, but you are very optimistic about it, in the fact that it allows us to be together in different ways. But I'd just like to know if you have any suggestions for what a platform can do in this kind of situation.
My immediate observation is that when we have this machine, which is a silent machine, it is a passive machine. And I think that is the advantage of this computer and imagery and kind of ideas or connecting people. The idea is, could we not really talk about visiting sites, going to places with these setup, and really talk about those things, because we will never go out of the office or a classroom. And even the classroom don't exist in India in the real sense. And the teachers have no time. The students come from far away places. If you go to see Bombay, people go by train and they don't carry the models and whatnot. And the numbers are 40s, 60s. There's hardly teachers have time to discuss. When will we have time as teacher to sit near a coffee shop and then talk about this? Supposing that this same setup I take out to the coffee shop and sit there and have tea and then I have a chat, would that not be the right thing to do? Tell me.
I would prefer that situation.
Pardon?
You remember one of the greatest thinkers of the last century, Jean-Paul Sartre.
Yes.
He wrote most of his texts in a cafe in Paris.
Yeah, I had heard.
I admire his writings, the intelligence in his writings, but when I read Sartre, I always find myself thinking, how could he come to this idea in a Parisian cafe, street cafe?
But actually, the point is that we are sitting now and we have in our mind a focus. But in reality, we don't want, now what we are talking about is something else which strikes us on the way. And I think that is what is advantages of this tool. The tool is giving us a chance to break away and come back to something that we thought of doing.
Yes.
Because it doesn't cost anything to us. We are sitting in one place, we are carrying it. Supposing that this instrument I'm carrying to a coffee shop, and then we are sitting there and there are two other people come and join and then we go. I think it's a great tool to really elaborate and then you close it up and go away. It has no burden at all.
Maybe there is a difference between the two situations, that you communicate with someone you have met and you know, like I know Doshi, and then someone whom you meet first. It's the same thing as when you have seen a painting or a work of art in real life, then even the photograph, the printed image, gives you quite a lot more, because
That's right.
you have already grasped its size and all of that. So perhaps this online connection works best with people who somehow know each other and their backgrounds, because then those backgrounds are automatically revitalized by one's memory, and it becomes more embodied in a sense.
That's right. Yeah, that is true. That is true.
It is very interesting because a lot of people on the panel are our co-instructors, and I haven't met any of them in real life, like Vignesh, Gayatri. I have never met them, and it's suddenly a new relationship has been forming, which is also very interesting. And some of I think the focus is always there are no travels anymore, there are no journeys, but one realizes that all journeys are to the within. We are all making finally a trip to our own selves, sitting wherever we are. And I think
Yes,
that's
but I think one very interesting thing that has happened, many of us don't know each other. The students, certainly, we do not know them. And yet, what Juhani was talking about, peripheral vision, to some extent has happened because in this space, there are 9 rooms, and we can go into the library, or we can go into the chai shop, or we can go into the next room and see what those people are doing. And so we have bonded somehow. I got very close to the people with whom I was interacting. And now I have moved to a new group yesterday, and I'm getting to know them. And I think what Juhani was talking about, of having known someone, now will at least to some extent have to happen like this. And the way in which we construct that, the possibilities of getting to know each other, is very important. And I think by some good chemistry, it has happened well here. And there is a lot of learning, because I was very skeptical that I could at all teach or interact with students in this kind of a format. And what you said about the fatigue of the screen, I have in an extreme manner. And still, I've been able to do 3, 4, 5 hours a day because I got interested in the people with whom I was talking. And I think that's a very important point that has, in the last thing that has come out, the important point is getting to know each other, getting to know places, as though she was talking about, so difficult in today's situation. You can't go with the group of students to a stepwell or to Mandu or to Fatehpur. But still, I think getting to know each other at least is a very important step.
Equally important is that we talked about this, Juhani talked about the step well. Nobody talked about it before. So it is not only listening, but also discovering something unknown. And I think that is where this tool, this instrument has been very useful. It's the first time that I'm participating in this, in a sense. And I'm so happy to meet, then you can talk to, everybody around separately, but also, casual talks. Like if one can take this instrument and go to the places which we talked about as characteristics, I think that is possible. It's only the laptop you pack, you go anywhere. So I feel this is a great place of learning, growing, knowing, and enjoying. I tell you why, because Juhani, after 3 years, I'm meeting him and I'm seeing him happy and he's still traveling. That was the time you had done 100 trips, isn't it? Or more than 100 now.
I can't say, but I'm catching up with your age.
Yeah. But you are as good, always fresh, I think it's a very good thing. Yes, so nice. I'm really, really happy that you're here.
Yeah.
In the afternoon, I said, how is he going to come? But then I had completely forgotten that we have this new tool. And I was wondering, is he going to come? So will he be tired? Will he be fresh? But here you are.
I always remember our meetings, for instance, the several days in
Dhaka.
Bangladesh,
Yeah.
Dhaka, that I have found it always extremely easy to talk with you.
Yeah, I think same for me, because there are different things, that you talk. Your interests are varied, and I am still puzzled with the book you gave me about these studies, of animals and birds and insects and whatnot. I mean, how you manage to get these things, that's something wonderful. And you remember, of course, so.
Yes.
See, and you connect it to architecture, you connect it to life, you connect it to place. That is important.
Well, everything is connected.
Yeah.
Whereas the society of specialization tends to separate things.
Yes.
You can be a specialist only if you separate things. But that goes against the essence of life.
No, but that is, I guess, exactly opposite of what we are wanting to do. I think that is important. So nice.
Professor Doshi, I just had a stray thought based on a few snippets of the conversation that happened. I mean, I was just marveling at the fact that currently we have access to tools that allow us to actually build this kind of virtual university in a space which doesn't have the constraint of gravity, which is essentially a hyperlinked kind of a object floating in space. Which could be based on the metaphors of a labyrinth. Many things that actually were spoken about as metaphors of space can actually be constructed in this digital realm, and it becomes a very potent tool for what Riaz is saying as a metaphor for a virtual platform. So I guess there's a crying need for architecture in this emerging domain as well.
The thing is, architecture is a multi-dimensional thing. This one is single dimension. Other thing is that I can talk about food and then I can tell you how beautiful, how tasteful it was. Would you know it at all? So there are certain things which you cannot do, certain things which you can. I think this has taken away the distance. So meetings and gatherings and elaborating on issues like this are very important. But the other ones are experiential, where they bodily, emotionally, psychologically appeal and you feel them. And I think that's where the difference is. Maybe Juhani has something to say.
No, I was just thinking further about this reduced communication. I have every now and then I have told my students that I learned more watching how my professors walked in the corridors of my university than listening to the lectures. And I'm not at all, how would I say, underestimating the intelligence or capacity to express themselves. It's just that how a person exists in this world. What space does he or she occupy? What positions does the body take? These are so important. It is always a great moment for me to see a writer or painter or architect or whomever whom I have known through his or her work in real. I just wait for that moment because immediately in split second when you see the person, something clicks. The whole production of a writer settles in my mind. So I'm again just repeating myself, suggesting that the physical presence is an utterly important thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree with you. It's like watching a movie and attending a shooting in a studio. They're totally different things.
Yes. Yes. Even when you turn off the sound from a film, it dies completely.
Yes, yes.
We don't consciously understand how important the multisensory reality is. But when we are in situations like looking at the film without sound, this is again a different thing than silent movie because they never had sound. The actors acted differently because they knew they had to communicate without speech.
Yes.
So I'm saying this just to re-emphasize the power of embodied presence and its centrality in architecture.
Actually, every tool has some advantages, but when we start using it for everything as if it's a universal, it's a big blunder. I think supposing we are talking about now the Indian meal and then we want to enjoy, I think if there were two dishes here and we were eating, I think it would have been a very different story.
Yeah.
So education is something which is very personal, and so it's a distant, but we never have talked to Juhani, and if he was here around and I would say, okay, but why don't you come out and look at the garden, or why don't we look at this book, and you move. I think there's a big difference in this. And those differences we cannot discount.
I would again thank you for spending so much of your time with us. And it's been 2 long hours. And I think on behalf of the panelists and all the attendees, I would like to say a big thank you. And I think there are no words that are enough to put a value to this wisdom that we've all been witness to. So again, thank you, and we wish you both a very good evening.
No, but thanks a lot for getting Juhani, and I have a chance to meet him. So I'm so glad. Thank you, Juhani, for coming.
Thank you, Doshi.
But I know how to catch you. I can get you now.
But we have to get the glass of wine together also.
That we will manage. We will get it. If not virtual, we'll find a way to meet somewhere physically. This was, bye. So, thank you.
Thank you.